Um, so today's talk is from the IRAP program. Um, Lisa Goddard and Jim Buizer from IRI Columbia and University of Arizona. And the work they're going to be talking about is part of some of the work that I've had the opportunity to be involved with. It's been some of the more rewarding things that I've been able to work on over the last few years. So it's great to have them here. And with that, I will turn it over to you guys.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. So this is a little loud. All right. Yeah, thanks, and thanks for everyone for being here. What we're going to do is, as John was saying, we're going to present on a project integrating climate information and decision processes for regional climate resilience. We refer to it as the IRAP project, and we'll explain that in a minute. It's a 5-year project jointly funded by NOAA and USAID, and it involves University of Arizona and Columbia University. We're involved in Caribbean, West Africa, and the Indo-Gangetic Plain. So we're going to show you the context of our work, what is our approach and what we've done for the past year and where we're headed. So, I should underscore that for me personally, I worked here for 20 years. I worked for NOAA. How important it is that USAID and NOAA came together jointly to fund this. There, of course, are different agencies with different missions, but it's complementary when it comes to this complex problem. I, for one, don't believe that federal governments writ large around the world have institutions that are. It would be sheerly accidental if they were created in the last century or the century before last, if they were organized in order to be able to address wholly these complex challenges. So it's great to see the two agencies come together, and they had the foresight to get experts from IRI, who've been involved in this work for 20 years, and the University of Arizona, who for decades also been working on a different part of this problem.
So just to give you a little heads up of how the seminar is going to work, this is very much of a joint project between IRI and the University of Arizona. This is going to be a joint seminar. We're going to be sort of tag teaming, swapping off between slides, both of us sharing our ideas with you.
And finishing each other's sentences.
So the 21st century has already seen a number of very devastating weather and climate impacts. Particularly vulnerable to these are developing countries. And so having timely, relevant information would certainly be critical to adaptation and to planning. And in fact, the fact that that sort of timely, validated, tailored information is not readily available to developing countries is one reason why they are so vulnerable in the first place.
But of course, it isn't just in developing countries. I mean, of course, here in the U.S., we are also impacted by these kinds of disasters. And we also need timely information here in our own country. And in fact, one of the reasons why it is so significant, if you take a look at, say, for example, Superstorm Sandy, we don't hear about massive deaths. We hear about massive economic losses. And those economic losses are tremendously significant. And we believe that working together, we can arrive at solutions that are integrated to help with these kinds of issues.
So are these impacts, is this a result of climate change? Is that even the right question to be asking? Certainly in a lot of cases, there is a focus on that. And so just looking at the 20th century observations, we wanted to put a little bit of context here. Climate change is actually, at least for precipitation, a relatively minor part of what's been experienced over the 20th century. What this map is showing you is if we took each of these grid squares and took that observation for the 20th century and then disaggregated it in terms of trends and decadal, multi-decadal variability, and then the year-to-year variability, these 3 time scales, how relatively important are they to the total climate that we've experienced? So looking at the percent variance explained. What we see is that almost everywhere in the world over the 20th century, trends have only counted about maybe 5% of what's been experienced for precipitation. the few places where it deviates notably from that, we know that there are much different drivers affecting those. If we go to the decadal scale, now we're looking at about 20 to 40% of what's been experienced over the 20th century at that time scale. But really the dominant contributor to what we've experienced, and so what we need to be prepared for, what we need to adapt to, is in this year-to-year variability, so accounting for about 60 to 80% of what's been experienced, and this is where a lot of the big socioeconomic impacts are. This is the droughts, the floods, the heat waves, active hurricane seasons, and so being able to provide information at this year-to-year timescale is really very important for adaptation and for resilience. But what's really important here, that the point is that in order to build resilience, we need to consider all the available information. So what matters is whatever time scale of information matters to you and to your decisions. So if you're a farmer, maybe the next season is what matters. If you're a city planner, you might want to know about the next few decades. And being able to make those decisions better has a positive, vulnerability-reducing, wealth-creating impact. So certainly the climate is changing, but most of those impacts and many of the decisions that need to be made, especially in developing countries, are happening at the year-to-year time scale. And to the extent that we can predict that year-to-year variability, we can provide that range of possible climate from one year to the next.
Right, and so adaptation. You've all heard the word. You all know really what it means. And what we're going to present to you is an understanding of the critical components of understanding the vulnerability of people, their ability to adapt so that we can increase resilience, and the different roles that different disciplines or different knowledge sets play, particularly when integrated, particularly when coming together as a full team to address some of these big challenges. And we see ourselves, so of course there's assessment of physical impacts, assessment of the social impacts, and the different components of adaptation. We're finding ourselves right here, but also in each one of these. And we're going to talk to you a bit about that.
So IRAP, you've heard this acronym a few times now. IRAP means International Research and Applications Program. Underneath that, we have this project integrating climate information and decision processes for regional climate resilience. And so this project is a 5-year project to foster adaptation solutions and build resilience in 3 regions of the world. We're working in the Caribbean, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, and then soon in West Africa. And this project has allowed us to bring together a very multidisciplinary team from IRI and University of Arizona. And these groups have a long history of engaging on these types of problems. And the other value of bringing together these teams is it provides us complementary expertise and perspective on things like climate services and climate risk management.
Right, and so I'm going to actually read this for you because we have our program managers, Lisa Vaughn from NOAA and John Furlow from USAID, and since this is what we told them we were going to do, I'm going to read this so I don't get it wrong. Foster adaptation and increase resilience of communities and sectors vulnerable to climate variability and change by supporting decision making. So you can think about this as supporting decision making through climate decision support tools and mechanisms and processes, and risk management through improved design, production, and provision of use-inspired climate information, particularly as an integral part of international development goals. What's really critical is that it's that we need to be flexible as we go, because this is quite a mouthful and it's a lot of work, and to actually get it done, we have to be very flexible. In fact, architects call it design build. You live there while you design it, and you learn things, and you etc. And the other thing to underscore is that we employ robust scholarly research methods. So everything that we learn, we actually do it because we've gone through and tested hypotheses and tested them and in real time applied them, and then go back and adjust the questions that we are asking to see if we're asking the right questions, etc., going forward. So you can imagine this is IRAP, or our program, is a little bit like, if you can just picture basic research meets use-inspired research, which meets applied research, meets applications, and then if you imagine evaluation cutting all the way through so that we can actually iterate how we approach our program. And so, again, we've organized ourselves around 5 what we call strategic goals, determining vulnerability and user needs, co-producing climate information, that is to help those people who are in charge of producing climate information improve their how they can do it by interacting and co-producing with the users of the information. Creating relevant decision support tools. It's kind of an easy thing to say, but a really hard thing to actually do and do well. Improve our system through evaluation. We'll come back around to that, but that's an iterative approach. So we are monitoring and evaluating as we go, and we're putting it right into the DNA of the program from the outset. And then, of course, building local capacity. We want to make sure that we do that. Technical capacity, scientific capacity to be able to use the information. We're working in 5 different sectors: water, disaster preparedness, extreme events, agriculture, but maybe more specifically food security, development, as I mentioned, and then coasts.
And I might add that the first 3 of these are actually the focus areas of the global framework for climate services.
Right. Yeah, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's a little bit, I could spend a whole hour probably. Anyway, we take, just to underscore that we start with understanding the decision processes within which the information is provided and the institutional framework within which it gets distributed and used. So that's really the framing of how we approach the issue. And we rely really heavily on conversations and engagement with our stakeholders, but also with our regional partners. And we're going to get into that in a minute as we describe our project. But so this is where we see ourselves right in here. And okay, so we work at universities. We want to be able to, while we do this, we want to be able to improve the knowledge base, fill knowledge gaps. And how do you do this? So, and we write technical papers, and there are peer-reviewed journals and that kind of thing. It's critically important to be able to create knowledge that is reproducible elsewhere. And so we create knowledge and evaluation. We further the research and decision support and then vulnerability.
So this is really sort of the big holistic picture of all of the pieces. And working with any one of these, then this sort of gives you a starting point of that conversation and where you fit into that bigger landscape. But
Lisa, before you do that, because climate science is right through the whole thing. So, this does sound a little bit, social sciencey, but physical climate science, you can't even start if you don't have anything to say about what's happening in the physical climate system.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Jim. So another way of viewing this program is through these 5 pillars. And then this approach really has been developed over nearly 20 years. It's based on long-term engagement and innovation with partners in developing countries, working on real climate-related decisions and development challenges. This approach is intended to work with information, solutions, impacts across timescales, so going from months to decades to even longer timescales. And these 5 pillars, which I'll step through just now, first to identify vulnerabilities and opportunities in climate variability and change, but in collaboration with the stakeholders. This is an extremely important pillar because this is where you really start to identify what are the most important problems and decisions facing the communities that you're working with. How do those systems work? Who's making the decisions? When are they making them? What are the trade-offs? As Jim mentioned, you absolutely need climate information, and that's feeding very much into Pillar 2, understand, quantify, and reduce uncertainties, because everybody is very concerned about uncertainties and risk. We're talking about there's always going to be uncertainty in information, and people are having to make decisions all the time in the face of uncertainty and risk. And if we know where those uncertainties are coming from, we can actually quantify them. Then somebody has an idea of where there are risks, and they can better then quantify things like trade-offs. But this requires good climate information so that we can learn from the past. We definitely need to monitor the present, what's going on now on the ground, and provide relevant information into the future. all of that understanding and climate information can then feed into interventions that help reduce vulnerability. So technical interventions, drought-resistant crops, the water capacities of soils, vaccinations for certain climate-related diseases. The fourth pillar has to do with identifying policies and institutional arrangements that can reduce vulnerability or transfer risks. So things like index-based insurance are here, early warning, early response systems. And then finally, evaluation, which is very important to, we're increasingly learning, to define at the outset of the project, having baselines, looking at outputs as well as outcomes. So these 5 pillars, I know it's very difficult to sort of envision what could go under those just in a listing here. So I'd like to sort of walk you through an example of how these could be applied in a particular context. IRAP, our program is fairly new. It takes a while to really establish this. So I'm going to use an example from IRI's work in Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is a model for these 5 pillars that I've talked about. This is some work that's happened over more than 10 years. But many of the lessons learned and the approaches are now being transferred to other areas or being scaled up. So just to be clear, Ethiopia is not part of the project that we're talking about. It's just serving as an example to step through the 5 pillars.
Right. Well, so before we do that,
Because it's related to Pillar 1.
Yeah, because it's related to Pillar 1. Before we do that, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page about what is vulnerability. How do you do a vulnerability assessment? Right? So vulnerability is to us a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So exposure is what we feel. That's a natural event. It's the rainfall, it's the drought, it's the flood, it's the extreme event. That's what everyone feels. And sensitivity then is much more social, personal. It is related to your own community or your own household. Those tend to be individual. They tend to be specific to your place. And so you can imagine that people can be exposed to the same thing, but actually be more vulnerable because of their sensitivity is different. If I happen to if I'm the little piggy living in a straw house, that's very different than I'm the little piggy that is,
The brick house?
The brick one, yeah. I don't know why I just said that. And then the third is adaptive capacity, is bouncing back. How capable are you to bounce back? And that has something, it has to do with what is your access to maybe loans or resources. And issues of social capital come in. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I just wanted to make sure that because it's the first pillar, that we understand, and there is really strong methods, social science research methods to arrive at this, because understanding that that it's more than exposure tells us why we have to have these integrated teams that make up the various disciplines from the physical to the social sciences.
So starting with the first pillar, which is to identify vulnerabilities and opportunities in climate variability and change in collaboration with stakeholders. So actually this example that I'm going to show you is a little bit different than the typical sort of vulnerability analysis. Well, not necessarily typical, but the more evolved vulnerability analysis that Jim was just outlining. This was an engagement with different levels of decision makers in Ethiopia around decision calendars for agriculture, things related to food security and fertilizer investments. And there the tasks were to identify what are the high impact decisions, who's making those at what level, and when do they have to make them, and what sort of economic trade-offs are they dealing with in making those decisions. And so the different levels are going all the way from the village and the county level up to the state and the national level, and this team was actually involved in the negotiations that happened through the year, both in developing the information that's making the case for, say, mobilizing resources, as well as feeding into national level programs. So they put together these this decision calendar for Ethiopia. What the blue boxes are showing you as you go through the calendar year, this is one calendar year, is when the main rainy seasons are, highlighting different parts of the country. And then these green boxes are the harvest times in the main cropping areas of Ethiopia. With this particular case of 2009, these the text outside of the boxes having some commentary on how the season actually played out. So what was learned in this? First of all, just an understanding of what decisions are being made at these different levels. What information is also being gathered was also very interesting. And so really, as you might guess after the fact, most of the information is being gathered, the impacts are being felt at the very local level, at the village, at maybe the county level. But most of the power, authority, decisions are being made at the national level. And so the connections between these different levels are not always very timely or effective. And certainly that could be improved by having a better understanding of who's making what decisions, where are the right entry points for engagement. So scale, again, really matters. And here we're talking about this sort of hierarchical scale, but also the flow of information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you have, earlier we talked about the time scales of sort of climate and the variability and change, and that matters to the decision, and then understanding really the scale of the decision that is being made and how, what the flow of information is. So there's an approach, a social science network analysis, to be able to understand who talks to whom and how and what happens to the information. Well, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the Caribbean.
So in the second pillar, which is to effectively quantify uncertainties, if we want to affect decisions and actions at the local scale, we really need to have good data at the local scales. So until now, what was available in Ethiopia was just station data. And that's very good at telling you at that location how much it rained that day or that month. But it doesn't really give you a good spatial picture what's going on across the country. Those are also usually located near towns and roads. And this actually may look, in a relative sense, like fairly decent coverage over the country of Ethiopia, but Ethiopia is a very mountainous country. So, you know, the difference between some of these stations may be quite a substantial piece of terrain. And so this is actually very limited coverage of these rainfall stations. We've also for 30 years had satellite estimates of rainfall. Now that does give us complete spatial coverage, but the quantitative information in this is limited until we have this localized observations to ground truth it, to calibrate the satellite information. So both of those things are really important. This is one place, as in many developing countries, where it's very difficult to get data out of the country. So the solution was to go work with the meteorologists in the country, have them quality control their own data, merge it with the satellite estimates, and come up with a hybrid data set that now has a 30-year history of monthly data at 10-kilometer resolution. And this same approach can be brought forward to help them monitor in real time what's going on in the rainfall and temperature as well. So this addresses the availability of data, but it doesn't address the access and the use of that information. So in order to address that, we've transferred the IRI's data library technology to Ethiopia. It's actually running on the Met Services computers, delivering map rooms through their own website. So, whoops, back we go. So we worked with them also to develop map rooms that allow them to do historical analysis, to look at what's going on now, and to work with their stakeholders, the Ministry of Agriculture, Water, or Health, to develop tailored map rooms that bring into context the information of those sectors with what's been going on in the climate. This is providing unprecedented access to that data, even to the meteorologists, but certainly allowing them to serve their stakeholders in a way that was not even possible before. And so the success and the positive reaction of this demonstration has led to a pretty substantial scaling up of this. This is part of a larger effort called ENACTS. And so this has already been implemented in Tanzania, Madagascar, and now Rwanda, dealing at a very regional scale with the SILS countries. And there's demand for it to happen in other places as well. And once we start building these types of high-quality data sets at a regional scale, and now we can take on larger regional issues like widespread drought and food security, transboundary water, things like that. And it also allows the countries to interact with each other, to share experience and knowledge in a way that wasn't really possible before, as well as to work with their own data in the scientific community, collaborating, working with the universities, et cetera. It's been extremely powerful. There's a huge number of partners that's been, and this is just for the Ethiopia case.
And Lisa, I was just going to say something. I really like this project. I wasn't involved in it, but I like it, and for a couple of main reasons. One is Ethiopia is a big country, and it really is challenging. If you take a look at eastern Ethiopia and western Ethiopia, it's geographically, topographically very, very different, climatologically very different. It has big rains and small rains and preparedness for each. It has so huge challenges. And on the social side, it's different cultures, and so the social challenges are big. You add to that, it's developing country status. I think it was a huge effort that you put on. And the other thing, the second reason is I love this South-South technology transfer thing, that what happened in Ethiopia now can be seen and used elsewhere.
So moving on to the third pillar, to identify technological interventions that reduce vulnerability. So sometimes a really effective intervention can be just bringing together different types of data sets. Not all climate-related decisions are just about climate, as I'm sure you all are aware. In this particular example, the motivation was to inform the application and investment in fertilizer in Ethiopia. So at the time, the government had a blanket recommendation on fertilizer. They were going to apply the same amount of fertilizer everywhere. So the first thing that happened was there was a collaboration between the Agriculture Ministry in Ethiopia, Columbia's Earth Institute, and this international program called AFSIS. They did a high-resolution mapping of the soil nutrients. And so they came up with these maps. And what you can see is that certainly there's a lot of heterogeneity in the soil nutrients, but and so already that can start to recommend differentiation in how much fertilizer is applied. But if you take these two circles that I've added here, the soil types are relatively similar in these two circles, but the rainfall that they typically experience is quite different. Fertilizer applied in wet areas is going to be much more effective, much more efficient than applied in dry areas. So in this black circle, that could be your recommendation given that soil type might be perfectly valid, but in this red circle, this is a place where, say, seasonal forecasts might come in and tell you what years are going to be a more effective investment for fertilizer than other years. And so, this was a really interesting research question. But it was also something that was motivated. We were asked to participate in this by the state presidents of Ethiopia, and we're still engaged with decision makers in those two regions. So another technological intervention is technology. So really being able to put that distilled climate information in the hands of farmers and decision makers is an extremely valuable thing. And it's one way that this going from the space to the village vision of NASA Surveyor is being realized. And this happens to be, by the way, the IRI data library and map rooms tool for a smartphone. But it could be SMS. There's a variety of technologies that can be delivered in this way. So the fourth pillar, identifying the policies and institutional arrangements that reduce vulnerability and or transfer risks. I'm going to sort of build up this vulnerability distribution here. So let's say we have a range of climate variability, and that's associated with impacts on social or economic outcomes. So in this case, we're going to look at crop production. So at some edge of that range of outcomes, you occasionally cross thresholds that are very harmful, and those may be drought years and lead to crop loss. And in some cases, those events might become so severe that it actually turns into crisis. where you have, say, widespread drought and famine. Now, many individuals and decision makers in developing countries make very conservative decisions because they want to avoid the impact of these bad years. And that's not even a typical year. So by always planning for the worst, you're missing out on the fact that most of the years are actually quite favorable. So those are actually missed opportunities. What policies and institutional arrangements can do is support things like, for example, agricultural index insurance, which can help insure against these relatively infrequent bad years. Even if you have seasonal forecasts, and they might be very skillful, there's still not. There's still going to be some uncertainty. There's still going to be some risk that needs to be dealt with in order to sort of get people to take advantage of these opportunities. And so effectively what you're doing is you are insuring the good years. You're insuring that residual risk so that farmers can invest in the seeds that they need or the new technologies and know that in the event that this unlikely bad year happens, they'll still be able to cover their loans.
And on that one, Lisa, I wonder, so are you working with insurance companies?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of partners involved in this. So the work to establish and to scale up this agricultural index insurance in Ethiopia was part of a public-private partnership. It started in 2009 with a couple hundred farmers in a few villages. It's now scaled up to over, several tens of thousands of farmers in over 80 villages and has been transferred to a couple of other countries as well.
Yeah, so one of the cool things is that when you work with, because one of the real big challenges is to be able to explain uncertainties to people. People do understand there's such a thing as uncertainty, but it's very hard to get people to understand sort of the quantification of reduction or increase in uncertainties. But insurance companies are all over that. So you don't have to then necessarily spend a lot of your energy going from farm to farm to farm, teaching people about uncertainties if you're working with the insurance company who doesn't understand that. Okay, so Lisa, let me talk about evaluation. Thanks. I'm all over evaluation. It's hugely important. So there was evaluation in the Ethiopia project, so Lisa tells me.
Getting ahead of myself.
Hey, there was evaluation in that project, and but it was sort of your typical evaluation. The evaluation of the outputs. So how many people showed up at workshops? How many people were trained? That's a reasonable thing to do because you can infer from that some things.
And there were some stories on the outcomes as well, and some very positive stories. A lot of pull created, but in some settings that's considered a little anecdotal, unfortunately.
Well, anecdotes and stories, at least anecdotes and stories are good. They're but anecdotes with data is probably more powerful. So what we're saying is that we bring in a robust and more scholarly, robust approach to evaluation if we do it from the outset. So not picking on Ethiopia, but we think we can improve on that going forward.
I agree.
So this integrated team, beyond, say, scholarly approaches to and methods to vulnerability assessments going forward, evaluation and stakeholder engagement or social network analyses, those kinds of things. Evaluation is another. And so what we do is we build it into the DNA of the program from the very beginning. In other words, it's as important as everything else that we do. And we have on our team people who have spent their careers doing evaluations, studying evaluation, how to figure out for World Bank, USAID, and elsewhere, evaluating not just the programs, but what are the impacts and outcomes of a program. That's really hard. It's hard, but it shouldn't be impossible. And so what we're saying, we're going to take on that challenge. We're using what is referred to as a theory of change approach, that we know that when we're looking at an impact or an outcome of something, that we can attribute that to what we did. Because we do know that in every place that we go, there are other livelihood projects, there are other efforts that are underway, which is all good, but we want to be able to say, this is what we did that resulted in that. And in fact, maybe even at a higher resolution, this is the component of our project that had the greatest impact. So that way we can know where to put our resources. Was it about training? Was it about changing the way we provide the information? What was it? And so that way we can adjust as we go. And it's going to take a while. It takes time. But by the end of this first phase of the project, we hope to be able to say something about that.
So this Ethiopia example that we've used for the 5 pillars, and this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is an engagement that's been going on for over 10 years. And so it's really quite evolved in the partnerships and the engagement and the trust that's been built up, which is now carrying it forward. It's really being sustained by the people in Ethiopia. But coming back to the Caribbean, we've been here only 1 year. And I think that a lot of what we've discussed can be applied in this context, taking the specific context into account. But I should mention that it is actually building on some momentum as well in Jamaica. So we're taking our IRAP approach that's been evolved over time. There will be a focused effort in Jamaica, which is building on a couple of years of investment from USAID. They came to us to talk with the Met Service and their stakeholders and really look for the sort of gaps and needs that they were facing. When we went in there, we really thought that the main concern was going to be hurricanes, that they wanted us to help them deal better with hurricanes. It said, well, we pretty much have that under control. What we're really concerned about was drought. Okay, well, we can work with that. So a working group was established between the Met Service and the Ministry of Agriculture to really meet regularly and work together on coordinated solutions that were what the agricultural ministry needed to deal with drought. And so as a result, they innovated on a new drought forecast, and that's now being scaled up through the Caribbean. And it actually has built very strong ties between the Met Service and the agricultural ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we met this lady, Elizabeth Johnson. She's with the...
Real nice lady.
Yeah, she's great. Inter-American Institute for Cooperation in Agriculture. We started talking to her, and she said, you know, I actually used the IRI forecast back in my ranch where I grow cocoa. And, okay, so while everyone else was losing 70% of their cocoa last year because of too much rainfall, I actually only lost 20%, so I came out ahead. What else can we do? And we said, well, how about working on something that within your organization? She identified coffee rust. Lisa knows this. I mean, anyone that's going to start impacting the supply of caffeine is really personal to me. But working with this whole group, what is it that we can do in over a long period of time, over 4 years, working as partners that are going to tailor information to specifically the questions that they're asking to solve the problems that they have when it comes to coffee. Coffee is a big deal, not just to me, but to the whole region. In Jamaica, it's tens of thousands of people are employed in coffee. It's a real big thing. So this is one of what we think is a pretty cool project going forward.
So this is an example of working at a very local, intense scale and maybe bringing that up. But we're also in these program regions working at the regional scale and taking that down. So in the first year in the Caribbean, our biggest activity was this 2-day workshop that was organized in Jamaica earlier this year. It happened coincidentally just following the Regional Climate Outlook Forum that was organized by the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology. They're the regional center for the Caribbean. And so that we have had a partnership with CIMH for some time, but being able to bring our program together with that meeting, which is very essential to the entire region, really gave it a lot of legitimacy and a lot of buy-in from the people that were involved. The goals of that workshop, the 2-day workshop of ours, was to advance the understanding of how climate information can inform regional risk management. This is an ongoing conversation. To inform the development of new climate-related decision support tools. So, for example, this drought forecast that was recently produced in Jamaica is now being produced by CIMH for the countries throughout the region. to develop partnerships for regional capacity building and to identify these sorts of focused projects to study the impact on livelihood. So this sort of coffee rest project was one of those discussed and identified. There were about 80 people at this workshop, and we collected a lot of data, including who those people were. So this is just the demographics of that workshop. The majority of the people there, the biggest demographic was the meteorologists and climate scientists, but all of these other sectors, health, water, agriculture, disasters, development, were also represented. And there is this big chunk that's called academic. Many of those academics were from the region, and they were involved in studying the connection between climate and the sectors or issues of development.
And we kept them really, really busy. We, for 2 days, it was, besides being a really integrated, diverse group, they were really active participants. They worked really hard. We split up. These are different approaches that we took to engaging and collecting data. So any social scientist in the room would recognize these as approaches that you collect data. And we got a lot of really good data. There's some reports out here of the that is out front. That's a synthesis of the thing. The data's not in there, but if you're interested, we can give it to you. We did our own literature review before we showed up. We wanted to know as much as we could before we got there. I don't know if anyone's been involved in a World Cafe, but that's when you have a small group, 5 or 6 people around a table, and then you split up the room and however many tables 80 takes, and then you have the same question, and then you rotate around. So everyone, and then you come back and you collect that information. So it's different groups of people addressing exactly the same question as you go. We also did a session of small groups on disasters. We did a social network analysis, which was also around a big table. We took big pieces of paper and we said, who do you talk to and what is the nature of the information? Who do you get climate information from? Who do you give it to? What do you do before you give it? Do you actually alter it? Do you contextualize it? Do you just pass it along? So we got to really understand. It's quite a big spaghetti diagram that we have. With, by the way, CIMH right at the center, as you can imagine. Did interviews, passive observations. That's where we sort of hovered. No, we didn't. Where we listened to people interact with each other and collected data that way. And then we had an evaluation session. I'll mention that. And we already talked to you a bit about using that opportunity and the conversations that we had with the people in the workshop to get their input about what might we do going forward in these focused projects. Right, and so, okay, so evaluation to the IRAP program is really important, and it's important to be able to set up a rigorous approach, a tested methodology and approach. We didn't want to go into the Caribbean and say, we're going to start evaluating you, and here's our methods. We're going to evaluate everything you do. We're going to evaluate the forecasts that you give. We're going to evaluate your... We didn't want to do that. We wanted to make sure that it was their program, that the evaluation that they helped us define, what was it that they wanted to evaluate with the focus on outcomes and impacts. But we understood that in order to be successful in this evaluation, we had to build trust and we had to show transparency. This is what we're doing. This is why we're having these conversations with you. This is why we think it's important to be able to demonstrate that we're making progress and successes, and then let them define what is important. Of course, with the original I mentioned earlier, what it is that we're doing and building evaluation right into our DNA. But so, for the purpose of Caribbean, we decided to start with building trust and building partnership and having the program be theirs.
Yeah, exactly. It's theirs. We're going to be there through the length of the program, and so they need to be part of it from the beginning. So some initial observations that were made, these have come out of the discussions that we had in those different sessions that Jim was just referring to. So the fact that traditional seasonal forecasts are underutilized. That's a sort of a common observation, in part because they're difficult to interpret. And that's related to the fact that they're often not tailored to the decision context of the people that they're trying to talk to. So related to that, bringing together the meteorological professionals and the sectoral experts results in more relevant information. This was an observation made by people at the meeting. I think if you would just ask them over lunch if they thought this was true before that workshop, they probably would have said, well, yeah, of course, but that's still not the way people work. And once they realized that having this conversation might actually affect this format of the forecasts and lead to more relevant information, that was really sort of a light bulb going on, and can potentially, after more, I mean, people go away from the meeting and they kind of forget the epiphanies that they had, but having this conversation ongoing can, I think, make a difference to the way people work together. It was also widely held that adaptation to variability in extreme events can build incremental adaptation to longer-term climate change.
So we're almost done. Initial findings from the Caribbean, from our workshop there and our conversations with the folks there. Of course, climate vulnerability varies by country. Anyone that's worked in the Caribbean knows it's a big place, it's really diverse in so many different ways, from culture to size to economy to capacity. The cool thing is, though, they like working together as a region, which is really interesting and useful for us, but also within countries. So in one of the conversations, we got some of the input that we got was, well, what happens is I work at the university. We have a little ranch and we produce, and it supplements our income. But my cousin that lives on the other side of the island, they named a place, my cousin, they're all in farming. And so actually the last time we had the hurricane, they had to come and live with us because we have another source of income. Yes, we had the same impact, but we had another source. So the vulnerability, okay, this is back to the social side. I think vulnerability has a lot to do with that. And that actually is connected to social capital. You know, people rely. There's another story about the person's neighbor roof went in. It went down with heavy rains, and so she had to live with them for 2 weeks. But their good friends who have a home in Miami, they just board things up, go to Miami, weather out the storm, come home and fix the roof. So it really does matter what is your own capacity, and you rely on social capital, which seems to be really big in the Caribbean. And the other thing is that while extreme events affect the livelihoods, as we just mentioned, it also can provide opportunities for transformation. That is, if you're going to, if your infrastructure breaks down as a country, maybe your road goes down, and if you're going to fix it back up, let's assume that you have the capacity to fix it, you can fix it different. So you can transform it now, and perhaps it can be more usable by more people.
So some research gaps that were identified, and these research gaps were not identified by us after analyzing the data that we collected. These were actually research gaps or research needs, I should probably phrase it, that were identified in some of these discussions. This evaluation framework, looking at the full end-to-end climate services from the production to the use, I should say production to the translation to the use, and cycling back for improvement, evaluating that whole process, that was definitely seen as a research gap, but I think that a lot of us are really trying to figure out how to do that effectively. Having a better understanding of the role of information brokers, the people that are attending those climate outlook forums that then have to go talk to people in their countries or have to go talk to the disaster agencies. You know, what exactly is their role? In a lot of cases, there were people that would seem to be their role, but it actually wasn't in their job description. And so, you know, this can be a very challenging thing. Better understanding of how drought forecasts and subseasonal forecasts can improve decision making. The reason that this came in as a research gap, these are, especially for developing countries, these are very new things. I would say even for the US, these are fairly new things. And so trying to understand those types of forecasts and how, again, this working between the Met services and the sectoral experts, you start coming up with more relevant information, how to tailor that in a way that the information makes sense for how people are trying to use it. And of course, further identification of the barriers and solutions for moving science to action.
And these are just some of the research gaps. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge gaps. So we're going to summarize. So this is what we hope that you heard from us, and I'll just repeat it very quickly. That IRAP, our program, is dynamic in that the people who are producing climate information are right there when understanding the social vulnerability, and so while we're looking at the demand, the assessment of the demand, they can react very quickly, and the program itself is demand driven. It focuses on understanding first the vulnerability of the system, and that it's focused on resilience. In other words, needing to understand better the broader networks of institutional actors who can contribute to adaptive capacity. That it's needs-based, so we have a needs matrix that we set up, and it sets priorities for the assessment of the relevant climate products. This is back to the second point, and that it's reflective, so that the impacts of the climate interventions, the forecast information, the processes, the training are subject to monitoring and evaluation throughout the whole process.
And then, of course, integral to this entire thing is partnership. The fact that you need to work with the people on the ground in the country, the people whose mandate is to deliver this information or to use it and make decisions. It's important to be engaged with those. So this is an image of the collaborations, the active collaborations that IRI has built and maintained since the mid-90s. And Arizona would come in with their complementary, maybe some similar but complementary list of partners. That's a really powerful collection of people to work with around the world.
Yeah, when Lisa showed it to me, I saw that she added this dot here in Tucson.
I think we're going to change it to a star.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, yeah, so Lisa is right. I mean, in fact, we're probably going to do a combined map so that we can do that. So we can show it. It'll probably be one big giant blob. But it's important because we have been working in the regions. And one of the reasons why we can stand up here and talk about all this cool stuff is a huge investment over the last decades by USAID, by NOAA, by the U.S. government as a whole in these kinds of things. And it's critically important to understand this stuff takes really a long time to get right. And we think we're getting there, but it takes a long time.
So next steps.
Right, yeah, so, okay, so we mentioned at the beginning that the project is Caribbean, West Africa, and the Indo-Gangetic Plain. Still lots to do in the Caribbean, and we described a little bit about that. Moving forward and more focused and et cetera. The Indo-Gangetic Plain, we're excited to get started there. We're not leaving the Caribbean, but we're going to begin exploring. It's a very, very different place, as you well know. Much bigger, lots of different people, lots of different kinds of social issues. A lot harder to work as a region as a whole than in the Caribbean. But anyway, we learned some lessons in the Caribbean, right? We'll take what we learned that is applicable in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. And then looking forward by this time next year, moving into West Africa, if at all possible. So, I don't know, this has been really fun.
Yeah,
for me.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Thanks to USAID for having this series and inviting us. Thanks to both NOAA and USAID for the funding for this project. We think it's just really phenomenal, and it has the potential to make a huge amount of difference in these regions. Everyone seems to be very excited about it that we talked to. Thanks to Agility for the logistics of this meeting, and to all of you for your attention and, I guess, questions to come.
Thanks. And I should say that
Can you sit up here?
it's very generous of you guys to keep thanking aid, but most of the
Thank you.
coming from NOAA. We'll take credit for NOAA's work, but it's really NOAA that deserves the credit. So
We're thinking forward.
Okay. Thank you. That was great. Questions for Jim and Lisa? And if you could identify yourself.
Yeah. David Himson with Sandra here from the Global Climate Change M&E project. We're involved in an evaluation of a Kazakhstan wheat resilience project. And critical to that are the seasonal forecasts. And yet, the last point I think was made, takes a long time to get it right. In other words, if you're doing evaluation, how are you evaluating yourself or institutions? How are you managing to know how the got it right, or how far you got it right but didn't get it absolutely right, the proportion, of a mistake, and what are the correcting mechanisms. Now, this is difficult because if you're looking at seasonal, people want results next year, and yet are you building up, really reliable models and so forth. Let me stop there.
So I really think that the evaluation questions need to go to Jim, and I'm going to push that off to Jim for the evaluation itself. But in terms of the forecasts, I think that because they are probabilistic, we're not giving it, this will happen. Part of the evaluation is the use of forecasts. Are people treating the risks in a reasonable way? And that is a capacity building issue, understanding, and also this issue of tailoring. Is the information coming through in a way that actually makes sense to how they're trying to use it? So all of those things are a way to iterate on what you're starting with and how you can make it better. And I think if the process is leading in a positive direction, then that's a positive evaluation.
Right, and so it does take a long time. And one of the reasons why most evaluations focus on the outputs is not because it's easy, but it's easier, and it doesn't take as long. You can count training. You can actually do assessments before and after training to see what kind of uptake there was. But did you actually impact the resilience? Is the real question, and that's the kind of question that we want to be able to answer. Don't know if we can, but we're set out to do that. And here's a thought on how. When we start with the communities to decide what is important to them and to evaluate, and what it is that we can as a program come in and help affect, ask them how to measure. So, for example, is it important to produce more crops? Is it more, and what is impacting your ability to produce the crops? Is it, if it's drought, then can you produce, as a farmer, what your experience has been with drought in the past. You know what kind of losses you have. I mentioned Elizabeth. She knows very specifically what the impact of her using that information when it came to her cocoa. She lost 30%. Everyone else lost 70%. Has to do with the fungus or something. I didn't get that quite right. But anyway, so once we have an understanding what that is, and then we are partnering with them, and they can come back and tell us this is the information that they're using, and this was their impact related to either their neighbors, who can be the control group without knowing it, or with their past. So that's an approach that we are embarking on. We're not going to pretend to be able to tell you that within a year or two, please Noah, within a year or two, we're going to be able to tell you what are the impacts of the program. But certainly within 4 or 5 years, hopefully we will. The other thing is that when you take a theory of change approach to evaluation, you can isolate the impact of your program specifically. So ideally, resources notwithstanding, so if we weren't constrained resource-wise, you could actually have entire groups that could be control, and you could have, so let's just say communities. You could go into Ethiopia and you have 10,000 farmers. Why don't you just pick 5,000? You don't give them any information. You could just take one of these kinds of sort of health type of approaches. You just don't, you take another 5,000 farmers and you give them access to the regular kind of information without perhaps any kind of interpretation or training. And then you have the 5,000 that you give them the IRAPA approach. And then over time, you can actually test, and you can actually differentiate then what is it within the context of all of the other things that are happening contributed to the better production or increased resilience to the variability. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but evaluation is hard.
Hi, this question is from Randy Freed. He is with ICF in Fairfax, and we've got about another 14 or so people here online too joining us. Just wanted to add that there. His question is to either of you. He says, have you compiled a set of info on how to translate projections to risks for different sectors? For example, can you share information across projects on how people in the ag sector should interpret a projection that precipitation will be 5 centimeters lower than normal over the next 6 months? He says, for a little clarity, he says the question focuses on whether there's sharing across geographies so as to inform decision makers on how to interpret the climate projections.
Is he talking about seasonal forecasts? Okay. I'm going to, if he's talking about 6 months, I'm going to assume that he's talking about seasonal forecasts.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so with respect to seasonal forecasts, I mean, those are probabilistic, and if they're done properly, those probabilities should mean something. So if you say that there's a 70% chance of not receiving 5 centimeters of rain or whatever your critical threshold is, 70% of the time you say that, that's what should happen. So you really want those probabilities to be well calibrated so that the risk is synonymous with the probabilities that are being assigned. If the information is being, so we put this in 2 ways. The information can be put out in a way that's flexible enough that people can go in and use that in the way that's relevant to them. The guy that wants to know 5 centimeters, he can find that out. The guy that wants to know 8 centimeters, they can find out. The person that wants to know 20 degrees C, they can find that out. Where that's not easily accessible or not easily accessed by the people that need that, that's where these intermediaries, these sort of information brokers, become very important to understand the information, to be able to retrieve it and translate it. But I will say it's been IRI's goal to work towards this sort of flexible information that does allow for that range of possibilities for people to look at a specific confidence that's required or a specific threshold that they might be interested in. And so that's one way to share a common product across geographies, is to make it flexible enough to address the different decision contexts.
Sudeep Vyapari with the National Council for Science and the Environment. This is great. Is there any reason why a community within the United States was not chosen for this project as a way of comparing? One question, and a subset of that is, when we go through the communities, we see people engaged in efforts like this at a grassroots level. They're either getting overload of information, and the midway through, people just say, I don't understand anything, and there is this other spectrum where I don't want to know anything. And that particular point you brought up about what you call as information broker, whom I call as storytellers, we have a serious deficit of them. So I'm wondering that having some sort of models within US and to see what impact there might be and how that research gap could work within our own communities. Because I think issue of building trust is as relevant here as any other place. So why was any community?
I agree absolutely. So I'm going to ask Jim to talk about the RESAs, the NOAA program RESAs, in just a second. But on these information brokers or storytellers, climate whisperers, there are some efforts that are trying to build that community practice. It's really a challenging thing because you want somebody with the depth of understanding that they can actually address the problem knowledgeably rather than just, hand over the answer that somebody else came up with. There is a program, it's funded by NOAA also. It's a postdoc program called Postdocs Applying Climate Expertise. And that program is designed to take PhD level students, early career scientists that have a strong understanding of climate, have PhDs in climate related disciplines, and embed them within decision-making institutions to really just totally marinate them in the jargon and decision context in an everyday sense that many of these institutions are facing. And so that program has been going on for 8 years now. It's been very successful. The biggest challenge is getting, part of the program is that the decision-making institution contributes 50% of the cost of the postdoc. So they actually have skin in the game. This is money they would have spent elsewhere, but they want to invest it in this. That's actually been the most difficult part of setting up these projects. But I think RESA sounds like
thanks, Sudeep, for the question. The short answer to your first question is it's where the budgets came from. USAID and NOAA, it was an international part of NOAA that funded this particular project. I'll let Lisa Vaughn actually add to that if she'd like. But not to worry, because another part of Lisa's office is funding the program that you're referring to, the Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Program. And I'm not sure how many there are now, but maybe 10 or 12 around the country, different regions around the country. And they're deep dives into the link between climate variability and change and people. They've been going on for almost as long as the IRI has. A lot of good lessons that have been learned there, and some training of some of these translational types. But I would agree with you. The knowledge brokers or translational types, really tough, because just coming from a university, I can tell you that there is no reward in being in that space. You just don't, anyone that's ever worked at a university knows that. You're sort of, oh, well, you're not a real professor, you're an extension person or something like that. And so, okay, so then where do they go? Well, maybe they're in agencies, or maybe they're in private industry, and well, that's not so easy either, because they're not necessarily contributing specifically to the mission. So it's kind of no man's land right now. We need to create that community and create reward and career tracks for them. Perhaps when some of the in some of the consulting companies that are represented by the folks here, maybe that's a space. But anyway, I do think it's an important point.
I'll just add that I think that the RISAs are really struggling with evaluation as well.
They are.
The RISA program that Jim and Lisa mentioned sits in the same section of NOAA, and we very purposefully keep them there so that we can make comparisons between what we're doing internationally and what we're learning in the United States. And in fact, in previous years, there have been methodologies developed in other countries, one in particular related to agriculture in South America. They then adapted that technology developed there and began to use it in the Southeast U.S. So we facilitate linkages wherever we can. Lisa and Jim and maybe one or two of their colleagues will be coming to a research meeting of the PI community, for example, the RISA PI community in January. So we do try to learn from what we're doing in both places.
And one last thing on that, because I forgot Zach. The person on the U of A side of this project, who is essentially the project manager, Zach Guido, was with, until I stole him, with the RISA program as their project manager. And so he just moved from one side of the office to the other. But with that, then, that cross-pollination of understanding has been very useful.
Let's talk about cross-pollination for one more minute. The evaluation scientist that's working on our side is also working on evaluations projects with the RISAs.
Hi, I'm Ian Fitzsimmons with Stillpoint Solutions. I was intrigued early in your presentation. You were talking about Eastern Africa and Ethiopia and other Eastern African countries. And it seemed like you were saying that by working to connect, to kind of build information and knowledge networks within the individual countries, you found that cross-national connections, you were developing an effect across an international community. If that's a fair way of paraphrasing it. And I wondered if you saw, given your focus on institutional development, if you saw any cross-national institutional cooperation growing at the same time. And I mean political institutes, not just academic institutes or NGOs.
I'm not sure I can address the political one. I will say that in Africa, the climate has already organized many of the countries regionally. So the climate outlook forums that have been going on in Africa since the mid-90s, there's a regional center in the Greater Horn of Africa, there's a regional center in West Africa, in Southern African countries, and now they're forming one also for the Central African countries. And that has been a really great way to bring the Met services and their stakeholders together to talk about the climate that's impacting them. And the process in those climate outlook forums has really evolved over time, becoming much more objective, and having the countries then build these observational data sets rather than just working with station data and sort of getting these point-wise anchors on what they think the climate outlook is going to be for their country, having this full map of what their climate data is really helping them put together better and more tailored forecasts for their countries. But if they can coordinate these, say, through these regional centers, now they can start to do that regionally. It's not clear to me that they're exchanging data regionally. But a lot of the climate services work really is being delivered at the national level. I think what the regional centers are able to do then is coordinate the climate information on the larger scale, and to the extent that there are transboundary issues, such as water or food security and things like that, migration even, having this common view of the climate, I think would facilitate that. I don't have any specific examples of that yet, though.
I wonder, Harish, if you...
Yeah, you sort of look like you want to say something there.
Actually, introduce yourself. He's another part of the team.
I think there's, so in Africa, so much happens because it's motivated by UN efforts or large NGOs. So you're starting to see the connections on that level.
Right.
I mean, the index insurance example you gave is now cross borders into Kenya and Rwanda with support of several groups. So so you're seeing that kind of collaboration. Having similar data is helping, obviously.
Harish is the deputy director for IRI.
He loves being put on the spot.
Hi, Andre Rashan from USAID. I have three related questions. One is, where are you going to be working in West Africa? That's the first question. And the second question is about the seasonal climate forecast. I was just in Niger and just did a presentation from a gentleman from Agromet who was discussing the seasonal climate forecast with some practitioners, shall we say, on the ground there who were rather skeptical about the utility of this information. And basically, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I mean, the regional climate forecast, as I understand it, is it tells you at a relatively large scale, well, what are the odds of the particular season for the rain being above, below, or at about normal. And there was a lot of concern, one, that this information wasn't specific enough, two, that if people followed this information, very poor people could actually make investments that would leave them worse off than they would have been otherwise. And so my question is, what would you say to some of the critics who still don't see the applicability, perhaps, of some of this regional seasonal climate information? And two, what are the opportunities and what are the chances that we will actually get better science on this over the near term, over the next couple years, that will actually improve that forecasting?
Okay, well, at a risk of hammering the observational point, observations is really a critical part to making that more localized, more relevant in the countries. Something that the community, both the climate community as well as the user community, really needs to sort of embrace is the fact that the seasonal forecasts are not always going to be something that you can act on. They're not always going to be confident enough in some sort of outcome that it motivates you doing anything different than you would in an average year. And this was actually a big part of the discussion that we had in the Caribbean as well. There was some part, and I think the map is in here, but it's certainly in the slides. So this new drought outlook was rolled out, and there was some part of the Caribbean that really was sort of drought watch. But there was another part that, maybe they had some drought occurrences, but it didn't look that devastating. And probably nothing that they can really do that's different that would make sense for them. And so this is an area of research, but it's also an area of practice to think through, well, what are those thresholds beyond which you're really going to have an impact that you need to deal with? How confident do you need to be in the information to make those decisions? And that's not something that the climate community can dictate at the outset. I mean, I will say in West Africa, there have been instances of seasonal forecasts being applied to spectacular success. Now, given that they're probabilistic, the unlikely outcome could have occurred, and then it would have gone the other way. But I'll tell a successful story anyway. In 2008, there was a forecast that suggested that extremely heavy rainfall season was more likely than not, and that was following on 2007 that had extreme rainfall season, a lot of floods, many people died, a lot of loss of life. It took over 40 days for the Red Cross to actually get in there and develop and deliver the aid. Working with the Red Cross and through the Regional Climate Outlook Forum, when that fairly extreme forecast came out, and it was a pretty confident forecast. We don't see those sorts of things very often. What they did was to really mobilize the Met services and the hydrologic services to say, okay, what could this mean for the chances of your rivers running over their banks? And so, and also that maybe the Red Cross should mobilize some of their resources, get them a little bit closer to the region so that if it actually does play out, they're ready to move in. And it did happen that there was extreme rainfall season, but it was, you know, I think there was a loss of 2 people died rather than dozens. They were able to respond in 2 days. It was also the first time ever that the Red Cross appealed for aid in advance of a disaster rather than in response to one, ever. And they got it, and it ended up overall reducing the cost per beneficiary by about 30%. So that was a very successful example. It's been written up by the Red Cross. Sustaining that, though, is a challenging thing. And the questions to why that is or isn't being sustained is worth asking. But again, I think that the confidence of the information, how potentially disastrous it is, that's a question really that the decision maker needs to take into account themselves. It's not something that the climate community is going to be able to dictate.
Yeah, and I'm not at all surprised that, I mean, I don't know Niger, but I'm not surprised that that you would have heard that, because Lisa and I have been hearing that for 20 years. It never is at the right resolution, because you didn't tell me what was going to happen to my farm. But lack of sort of specificity or resolution shouldn't be an excuse for lack of action. And even if your action is to decide, I can't do something about it right now, as Lisa was saying, because it's what the science can do. So, I mean, I lived in this town through an administration that used to tell us that we don't know enough about the climate system to act. And that can be an argument, but over a long enough period of time, it's not a good argument. Now once in a while I'm accused of being a social scientist. That's the physical scientist in me saying. On the social side, when you've got someone betting the farm, right, literally betting the farm, just not listening to us scientists actually makes more sense, because they haven't in the past and they're still alive.
All right, I think we have time for one more question if it's short.
And Tony?
This is Jenny Frankel-Reed from USAID. Thank you very much. It looks really exciting, and I'm thrilled to see it happening. This is a question I get, so I know how much you'll enjoy it. Which is, you've been doing this for a long time, and so you must have lessons about sustainability of these services really being able to continue after they're developed and transferred. You're working in 3 very different regions, and from what it sounds like, 3 very different scales, regional to national to sort of the individual. So this is why this isn't a short question, but are there some, I guess, key lessons about sustainability that you think can be applied given all of that variety of what you're trying to achieve?
You want me to start with that?
You start one, and I have a specific story too, so go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not as good a storyteller as Jim. Yeah, I mean, every region is different, and it's also going to, it depends not only on the regional problems and characteristics, but it's going to depend on the individuals involved. So you might have set up something just brilliant and it's working well for the agency, and then the key person in charge of it leaves and the whole thing falls apart. I mean, some of those things are just unavoidable. But in terms of what you can do with the best, best practices, if you will, that's kind of jargony, is what Jim was saying, to really involve them in the project. So this co-production, also very jargony, it's just critical, because the job is not for us to come in and solve their problems. It's for us to work with them to help them do their jobs better and more effectively, and really create a pull for what they can do. And if we're doing it, then it's not going to be sustainable. But if we can create that capacity and the light goes on of what can be done, and they're working with the people, and those people are getting excited about it, that's a really successful thing. And I think that those are the situations that have the best chance of success and being sustained.
Yeah. So I'll underscore that with a story. I think it's absolutely critically important to involve the people from the outset and have them really be involved. That's actually the Ethiopia story is a really cool one because it's not something that you're doing from New York. You helped them create their own capacity in Ethiopia. So if we come back here in 10 years, be willing to bet you the Ethiopia project is still going, and probably not necessarily with the U.S. funding. The Climate Outlook Forums. So Lisa Vaughn dreamed these up. What year was it? 1992 or somewhere around there, late 80s, and they're still going. Long after she came up with the concept and to have these, they're going and they're going on their own. And in some cases, without any support from the U.S. government. A number of cases without any
Actually,
support.
the Caribbean, they do meet, well, it was once a year, now twice a year, but they do it virtually every single month.
Mm-hmm. And in Central America, Patricia Ramirez has been doing, I think, 32 of them 3 times a year for the last 10 years or so. Why? Well, because we were, in some cases, lucky, but in other cases, pretty strategic about getting exactly the right kind of people to work on it, get passionate about it, engage them, and legitimize them as leaders by our attention at the outset. The last example, and then this is still to underscore that, is that when I was at NOAA, one of Lisa's colleagues, Candace Clark, started a project in Bangkok with a small group at the Asia Institute of Technology because there was a workshop and it was about communication and climate, and one of the participants was from India, was there, when he went back after the workshop, decided he wanted to work on this problem, so found a way to get back to Bangkok. Subaya then set up his project, and it became RHYMES, which is now an international organization. Again, it was make enough investment at the beginning, legitimize the people so that they can be credible within their own community, do it long enough so that it can get legs, and then it can be more sustainable. And I think that the key is what you were saying, involvement.